I'm Faz Shakir.
I'm Amanda Litman, and this is Battleground. Faz is still gone this week, spending time with his very cute new baby. Our guest this week is David Daley. He's the author of Rat Fucked, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, and Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy.
This is a battle for the kind of country we want to live in, and it's up to all of us to be part of that fight.
Dave Daley, welcome to Battleground.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
For listeners who might not know you, who are you? What do you do? What's your story?
I wrote a book called Rat Fucked about partisan gerrymandering, and at the time I thought, well, this is just a small little book and this will be an interesting thing, and then gerrymandering completely took over my life. So once you start looking at the world through the lens of redistricting and our politics through state legislatures and district lines, you become frankly insufferable. And now there's nothing else I can do because nobody else will have me.
I think redistricting and the process in 2010 and the state legislative elections that led to the redistricting crisis we're in now is one of the most, it's somehow both over-discussed and under-discussed political stories of this moment. Like, we literally can't talk about it enough, in part because I think the people who control the mechanisms to fix it don't seem to understand how much of a crisis it is. So we'll get into that in a little bit. I want to just start by defining some terms. So let's do quick. The difference between reapportionment and redistricting.
Reapportionment is when the number of House seats that each state has is adjusted for population after the census. Redistricting is when every state legislative and congressional seat is redrawn every 10 years after the census.
And gerrymandering is
when partisan politicians take advantage of the process of redistricting to draw lines that lock in an advantage for themselves for the next decade.
And can you give us a very TLDR history of gerrymandering?
Patrick Henry tries to gerrymander James Madison out of our very first Congress. As long as we've had politicians, they have tried to rig the lines to give themselves advantages. It is oddly, however, a uniquely American problem. Other countries around the world do not district the same way. They don't let politicians have control over this process. There was a governor of Massachusetts named Elbridge Gerry who in 1812, his party, the Democratic Republicans, tried to draw lines for the state Senate districts around Boston in such a way as to screw, once again, the hated Federalists out of the seats that they thought they'd win that fall. And one of those districts in the Boston area resembled a salamander to a political cartoonist. And so Elbridge Gerry goes down as the father of gerrymandering. While we have had gerrymandering for hundreds and hundreds of years, it really explodes in 2010. And that is because really of two things. I would say one is the political intention that Republican Party operatives recognized after the big blue waves of 06, of 08, the demographic trends that were not heading in their direction. They realized that they needed a strategy, a path back to power. And they saw that the 2010 election, being a census year, that if they could redistrict in such a way as to give themselves an edge, that would be very valuable at a time in which the country was heading politically in the other direction. But also it's because the sophistication of the map-making software, the power of the computers, and just the granular nature of the big data that is available to map makers in 2010 is of a magnitude of the like that, Patrick Henry and Elbridge Gerry didn't have this, but the folks who were drawing lines in 2000 didn't have it either. There's a quantum leap between 2000 and 2010. The term on steroids is overused, but that's exactly what it is. 2010 is gerrymandering on steroids. It locks in historic advantages for the party that was in control. That was the Republican Party, and that is in many ways the story of our politics for the last decade.
So there's a couple of different levers folks can pull, in particular Republicans tend to pull when they're thinking about the gerrymandering and redistricting process. There's the technology that they use, which you just touched on. There's the partisan sort of nature of the process of who gets to control drawing the maps, which we'll get to a little bit. But there's also the underlying data, which comes from the census. And the 2020 census data, we conducted it during a pandemic, one might recall. It was bad. And it was bad both because of the pandemic and also because of the Trump administration's intentional effort to rig the count. How do you feel about how the Census Bureau ultimately managed this task? And do you feel like the numbers are accurate?
It appears that the numbers are accurate. The basic population numbers appear to line up with the estimates of where folks imagined that they would. The collision of that census data with the redistricting process is what I think we have to worry about. Because what the census data shows is a population that is growing slowly, but that almost all of that population growth is due to Latino and Asian voters. And it's especially due to Latino and Asian voters across the Sun Belt. So whether you're talking about North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Texas, this is really where the population is changing. It's where the population is growing. Many of those states are the ones that received additional congressional seats through reapportionment. And those are states where Republicans effectively control every lever of redistricting. So these population trends are on a collision course with Republican control of redistricting in all of these key states, with a 5-seat Democratic advantage in the U.S. House. The census shows us becoming an ever more diverse multiracial nation. This process will determine whether we can actually become a multiracial democracy. And there are a lot of forces that appear to be lined up in the way of that. They could pass a law that is popular, or they can lose the House maybe for a decade.
It's not a secret why they are doing this. They don't want people of color and young people generally to vote, because if they vote, they probably won't win.
It's not a secret why they're doing it. And it's not a secret how easy it is to use this process to get away with it. I mean, in 2011, Texas wins 4 additional seats in the U.S. House through reapportionment. And something like 90% of the population growth that drove those 4 seats in Texas was due to communities of color. And Texas Republicans drew a map that not only failed to create a single additional opportunity district for candidates of color, but took one of the old ones away. And so this is what we're looking at this time, right? I mean, Texas is up by 4 million people. More than half of that is Latino voters alone. What are the maps going to look like? I mean, Florida is up by 2 million people. 54% of that growth in Florida, Latino voters alone. How are our districts going to be drawn that reflect that changing personality? Or will Republicans draw districts that solidify their incumbents and pack Democrats and communities of color into as few districts as possible? Given what happened last time around, I think we've got a little bit of foreshadowing as to what the answer will be this time.
Do you think we are underselling the power of RedMap from 2010? And can you define RedMap for folks who might not be familiar?
RedMap is the redistricting majority project. It created exactly what it was named after. Republicans recognized that state legislatures provided the road to power because state legislatures control these maps in about 75% of our states. So what Republicans did in 2010 is they focused on winning back state legislative chambers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Indiana. And they invested $30 million down ballot in these local races. And in the last 6 weeks or so of the campaign, all of the focus group research into sort of the negative issues that would work was unleashed. Hundreds of thousands of dollars dumped into these local races, drowned and swamped incumbents who never saw it coming. Republicans took over the chambers, remapped the following year, and Democrats could not take back a single one of those chambers in any one of those states or any of the other ones for the next decade to come, even when they won hundreds of thousands more votes. Democrats did not win back a single seat in our most gerrymandered states. Nothing in North Carolina in 2018, nothing in Ohio, nothing in Wisconsin. By 2020, you had courts overturn Republican maps in Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Virginia. Republicans would have held the House in 2020 if not for those two lawsuits that forced fair maps in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. This is the impact of gerrymandering. Republicans lost the popular vote for the U.S. House in 2020 by 4.7 million votes. But had those lawsuits in two states gone the other way, it's a 218-217 House. The idea that gerrymandering is overblown is just absolute bullshit.
It makes me so angry when folks from the White House say, well, Democrats just have to out-organize the gerrymander. You just got to work harder. You cannot out-organize a gerrymander.
Democrats have to win by these huge numbers to have even a shot at a slender majority. And that's why you can't out-organize this. You can't outwork a partisan gerrymander. And when you add voter suppression on top of that, in some of these states like Georgia and Arizona and Wisconsin, that 10, 15,000 votes is the difference between them going red and blue in the 2020 election. Instead of passing a law, they're trying to tell us to out-organize and outwork it.
I mean, this is why people like you and I are losing our minds a little bit, because it feels like we're being gaslit.
We are. Democrats, Republicans, independents, everybody hates partisan gerrymandering. They could pass a law that is popular, or they can lose the House maybe for a decade. You tell me what they're going to choose.
I have never once had faith in Democrats finding a backbone. So don't look to me for optimism here. One argument I have heard is that things are bad. Things are bad, and we're in a better place we were than in 2010, in part because we're winning Virginia, in part because of a number of independent redistricting commissions, most notoriously, I think, in Michigan, where there is actually a chance for Democrats to win the majority in the 2022 elections. Can you talk a little bit about both how that works and what the sort of possible crises could be with even an independent commission?
What happened in 2018 in many ways is a magical story of citizens coming together and winning independent redistricting in Michigan and Colorado,
through
Utah,
ballot initiatives, mostly.
Missouri, through ballot initiatives. So these are citizens, oftentimes young people, coming together, running petition drives, raising the money, and convincing their fellow citizens that there's a better way to do this. And in Michigan, they won with 61% of the vote, and they're going to have an independent commission draw lines that last time around were so toxic that Democrats couldn't win on them for a decade. So that's all great news. The trouble is that these commissions can be really easily gamed, and that Republicans have figured out how to do it. And right now, around the country, Republicans are manipulating and hijacking these independent commissions in such a way as to corrupt the integrity of the lines they're going to draw.
It is striking. They don't do any of this in secret. It's not low key. It's not under the radar. They say the quiet parts out loud.
We, to the extent, are going to use political data in drawing this map. It is to gain partisan advantage on the map.
We're going to do partisan gerrymandering. It is in many places going to be incredibly race-based. But surely, Dave, won't the Supreme Court do something? Please, won't they help us? Why is it... Explain the context for the Supreme Court here. Why will they not weigh in?
John Roberts has essentially made his entire career out of trying to eviscerate the Voting Rights Act. This goes back to his very first job in Washington as a young aide at the Justice Department in the Reagan White House, trying to convince Ronald Reagan not to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act as far back as 1982. Roberts is on the Supreme Court. He becomes Chief Justice by 2013 when he writes the decision in the Shelby County case that effectively undoes the preclearance formula that had held back some of the worst race-based voting laws in some of the jurisdictions with the worst record on attempting to pass those laws. Roberts said, well, it's not the 1960s anymore, and these states shouldn't still be judged as if...
We're over racism now.
John Roberts doesn't see color.
Neat.
And, Justice Ginsburg famously said, you don't throw away your umbrella just because you're not getting wet in the middle of a rainstorm. The Roberts Court has really been a wrecking crew on voting rights. They have done for the Republican Party through the courts what they have not been able to do legislatively, which is effectively gut all of the most crucial and effective civil rights legislation that the nation has ever had. And in many states where the state Supreme Court becomes the only road to protest these maps, even the state Supreme Courts have been hijacked.
And this is what's happening in Florida now, yeah?
Florida, Texas, Georgia, Arizona, these state courts have been really packed over the course of the last decade with partisan judges. So while Democrats did win important cases in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, I think that the road offered by state courts to fair maps in 2021 is a really bumpy and uneven one, because you can't count on the judiciaries in these states to make similar rulings. And it's these states where the maps are likely to be the most egregious, where Republicans have also already built in the protection of a conservative Supreme Court. It's hard to look at what's happening in state legislatures around the country and say, oh, I'm just overreacting, or this is hyperbole.
Pretend you have the ears of the Democratic majority in Congress. What do you tell them to do so that a majority of voters' voices matter?
You pass the For the People Act. You pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You add states to the Union. And you find a way to reform the U.S. Supreme Court by adding justices or installing term limits. We pretend that even these structural barriers that Democrats are facing right now were not intentionally created. These are not handed down on tablets and preserved in amber. They have been adjusted many times in our history, usually for nefarious partisan purposes. And it's broken. We are at a really dangerous moment in our history where just about every institution is about to become anti-majoritarian. Some of them have been stacked that way intentionally. Others of them are simply tilting in that direction. 70% of Americans are going to live in 15 states by the middle of the 2030s. They will have 30 U.S. senators. The Electoral College, Joe Biden won by 7.5 million votes. With the popular vote, he won the Electoral College by about 44,000 votes in 3 states. 3 states that are working on voter suppression methods right now as we speak. We see what's happening in Georgia. We see what's happening in Arizona. We see that presidents who have lost the popular vote have appointed 5 of the 6 conservative justices onto the U.S. Supreme Court. And now we see what gerrymandering is going to be able to do to state legislatures and to the U.S. House for a decade. And it's going to doom many of our states to being anti-majoritarian for a generation, because places like Wisconsin and North Carolina have been suffering like this for a decade.
And really, like, it's not, you said this earlier, it's not just about the political impact of this. Like, the Republican Party at this point in time does not seem to care about the life and death of their voters. When Republicans are in control, health outcomes are worse. We are now seeing the pandemic. People are dying. It is dangerous to live in a place with Republican control.
People will die. People will die. People have already died. I mean, the water is still not drinkable in Flint. If you live in Florida or Texas, you're probably wondering if you should send your kids to school right now. This is where we're headed. Democrats have what could be a once-in-a-decade opportunity to do something about this. They could pass popular legislation to fix it. And that's what they have to do. There's simply no way around it. If they fail to do so, they will probably lose the House in 2022.
Senate's, I think, kind of hit or miss here.
The Senate map could go either way. Who knows what happens in the governor's races in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in 2022? Those could be the most important races other than, a handful of Senate seats. And it sets up a presidential election in 2024 that, if you think 2020 almost went off the rails, that was a dress rehearsal for what you will see if Republicans control the House and are unwilling to accept a Democratic president. What happens if it's Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis elected president in 2024 via the Electoral College, even though it's another 7.5 million vote victory for a Democratic candidate? What happens if it's a Republican U.S. House, even though 4 million more people voted for Democratic candidates? What happens if Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and all of these states, once again, more people prefer Democratic candidates, but the Republicans are in charge? The very legitimacy of every institution is at stake. Where do you go to appeal for basic fairness in a representative democracy? It's not going to be the U.S. Supreme Court.
Are there any Democrats who get the urgency of this moment, who understand this crisis and are doing something to fix it? Who are they? Tell me what they're doing.
It's a really good question. I think that there are some, right? But I don't think that there's enough, and I don't think that there's 51 of them in the U.S. Senate. I think that Jamie Raskin and Don Beyer get it. I think that they've got something called the Fair Representation Act, which would effectively rework the way we elect the U.S. House into something much more proportional and kind of re-incentivize politicians to stop catering to the insane base on the right. Effectively, it includes ranked choice voting and larger multi-member districts and a more proportional way of doing things that I think is the kind of big structural thinking that we have to be doing to kind of get our way out of this. But I don't see enough Democrats talking about court reform. I don't see enough Democrats talking about what do we do about the U.S. Senate. Because there are really interesting reform possibilities that would hold constitutional muster. And if we don't do something about it shortly, we're going to be out of time. I mean, it sounds apocalyptic. It's hard to look at what's happening in state legislatures around the country and say, oh, I'm just overreacting, or this is hyperbole. It can happen here. And I think this is what it looks like.
I am probably as guilty of this as anyone, of feeling a little hopeless. And I think that is in part a byproduct of a Republican strategy to get us to feel hopeless, to get us to feel like there is nothing we can do. That being said, I want to make sure that we don't end on a low note. So is there stuff that we as voters, as actors in this space can do. Is there any hope for a ultimately multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-class democracy?
Yes.
Yes.
There absolutely is. But it's going to take huge courage and a lot of work. I mean, democracy is a verb, and it's all of our responsibilities to sort of use it actively, and to go ahead and do that work. I mean, in the same way that you get up and do this work every day. I mean, I went out and wrote a book about all of the optimistic efforts that were going on around the country, called Unrigged, that optimistically came out the day that the pandemic started. There are amazing stories of people around the country who have done unbelievable work in places where you would never imagine it possible. You can be victorious anywhere, and you can have amazing, amazing impact. But it's not easy. And the other side doesn't make it easy. This is a battle for the kind of country we want to live in, and it's up to all of us to be part of that fight.
Dave, thank you for having this conversation with me today. It is my favorite topic, and one I don't think we can talk about enough. So thanks for taking the time.
Such a pleasure, Amanda. You're a hero of democracy. Thank you.